Robb Stark's last living sensation was agony, and then the world surrendered into a dull, echoing hush. The clangor of steel and the shrieks of betrayal had died away, leaving him with nothing but a sense of free fall, of darkness seeping through the corners of his mind until it flooded his consciousness entirely. In that nameless void where neither breath nor pain could follow, he ceased to be Robb Stark, the king in the north. He became only a shade of who he once was, lost in a silence that stretched beyond time. Yet in that darkness, a single spark of red light glimmered, pulsing in the empty gulf like a distant star. It beckoned him without words, without warmth, yet it was the only sign of anything but pure oblivion. If he had lungs in that endless black, he might have drawn breath to call out. Instead, he merely drifted, watching as the crimson flare expanded, flickered, and surged with each passing moment. Slowly, like a seed taking root in barren soil, the light sprouted tendrils that coiled around him, binding him, drawing him back towards something more tangible than eternal night. He came to realize he was not alone in that darkness. An ancient presence lay coiled within that ember of light, something older and fiercer than any mortal soul. He felt it scrutinizing him, testing him, wrestling with him as though his spirit were a wild beast to be tamed. If he had been capable of terror, he would have trembled. If he had been capable of speech, he would have cried out. But there were no words in death. There was only that gnawing sense of presence and power, a cosmic scale he could not comprehend. He was but a mote of dust on the edge of an infinite gulf. The red glow suffused him, saturating that emptiness with a faint warmth. It tugged on him like a distant tide, and at last, he felt something akin to breath hitch in his lungs again. Yet he had no lungs, no flesh, no bones. His entire essence felt suspended. Then came an explosive flash that scattered the darkness in every direction. His consciousness whirled, caught in that conflagration of color and heat, and for a heartbeat he wondered if this was yet another betrayal, a final indignity after his savage murder. A woman's voice whispered through the haze, low and resonant, commanding the energies that coiled around him. He could not see her, but he felt the authority in her tone. She was binding something in flame, calling out to a deity he did not know. From the blackness of oblivion, Robb felt his spirit pulled relentlessly forward until the substance of his being shuddered. Then he felt pain again. The shock was immeasurable. His muscles clenched. His mind reeled. All that was numbed in the darkness came rushing back in a tidal wave of sound and fury. He felt cold air rasp across his teeth and bruise his raw throat. He felt the tightness of a chest half caved in and lungs that were battered from the inside by a heart that refused to quit. He felt a cold surface beneath his back. His eyes flew open with a strangled gasp. Guttering torchlight seared his retinas. He coughed violently, chest constricting, air scalding down his windpipe. A trickle of blood escaped his lips, splattering across his chin. Someone hovered over him, no, more than one someone. His vision swam, and he only caught glimpses. The sheen of red hair, a face carved in the sharp angles of a zealot's devotion, a faint perfume of smoke and spice that clung to the air. He tried to speak, to ask for his mother, for Grey Wind, for any of the loyal men he had once commanded, but his throat refused to form words. When he finally managed to rasp something, it was little more than a weak, ragged groan. "Breathe, your grace," the voice commanded. There was an accent, a smokiness to it that Robb didn't recognize. The words snapped like a hawk's cry in the hush of the chamber. "The battle you fight now is for breath itself. Breathe." He gulped down the chill air, forcing his heart to slow. His head rolled to the side. Rough stone walls loomed in uneven silhouettes. A single torch crackled in its sconce. Shadows danced with mad intensity across the walls, moving in tandem with the swirl of heat that emanated from a brazier. The woman stood at its edge, her red robe half lost in the darkness, her flame-kissed hair bright as coals. He knew she must be Melisandre, the Red Priestess he'd heard rumors of during the war. He had never met her, had never so much as shared a word with her, and yet here she stood as though she had stepped out of a fever dream to conjure him from the grave. He coughed again, and she reached out, fingertips pressing lightly on his forehead. The gesture sent a thread of warmth through his skull, and it felt as though some oppressive layer of confusion began to lift. "This cannot be," Robb rasped at last, voice trembling. My men. I remember treachery." She nodded with the calm of one well-versed in the impossible. "You died, Your Grace, and now you live again, by the grace of the Lord of Light." He stared, too overwhelmed to conjure an argument. He thought of arrows bristling from his body, the searing, metallic taste of blood in his mouth, the false laughter of that wretched feast. He remembered Walder Frey's smug grin, the tearful shock in Catelyn Stark's eyes. A swirl of images tumbled through his mind, vivid as shards of glass. He tried to reach for them, to make sense of it all, but the effort cost him every ounce of strength. He collapsed back onto the cold floor. Behind Melisandre, a cloaked shape stepped forward. The man wore a stern expression and kept his distance, as though uncertain of what manner of creature Robb might have become. Robb did not recognize him. The man's clothing bore the distinct lines of a Northman's garb, though no heraldry was visible. His eyes looked haunted, and there was a severity in his posture that told Robb he was someone who expected danger at every moment. "That is Daeron of House Locke," Melisandre said softly, noticing Robb's effort to focus. "He was one of the few men who dared to believe in your return. Others fled, calling me a witch. Many times have I performed miracles of flame, but never before have I resurrected a king." Daeron took one knee, though his gaze still seemed unsettled. "Your Grace, he faltered, searching for words that would not betray the storm of emotion on his face. "All the North grieved for you. We thought, when we heard the phrase monstrous betrayal, there was no hope left for us. But the Red Woman insisted that if she could but reach your remains, if she could perform her rites, perhaps the gods would restore the king in the North." Robb's heart hammered with a mix of outrage and impossible relief. They had stolen his future, destroyed his family's hopes, and yet here he lay, alive. But what manner of life was this? His every breath felt ragged, as if his lungs were unpracticed at drawing air. A vile aftertaste of blood and smoke coated his tongue, and his limbs shuddered with weakness. He felt as frail as a newborn pup. It took all his will to raise a hand and grab hold of Daeron's sleeve. "My mother?" he croaked, refusing to let himself hope. Did you?" Melisandre's composure did not falter, yet a faint trace of pity touched her features. "She was lost. I arrived too late, and even the Lord of Light has his limits. Your mother's condition was far gone by the time I had the chance to intervene. But you, Your Grace, there was enough left of you to work with, and the fires told me it was your duty yet to be fulfilled." Though he had been braced for the worst, the words still struck Robb like a sledgehammer. He closed his eyes, a tremor coursing through him at the memory of Catelyn's final moments. How could he face the world now, bereft of her guidance? And Grey Wind, he recalled the direwolf's tortured snarls. An ache flared in his chest that had nothing to do with physical wounds. He tried to gather himself, tried to cling to the notion that he was alive for a purpose. That was what the Red Woman said. He had a destiny yet unfulfilled. As rage and grief warred within him, he found a glimmer of something else. Determination. The future might yet be reclaimed. His enemies thought him dead. Let them keep believing it a while longer. He swallowed, forcing his voice to steady. "Why?" he asked, trying to pin Melisandre with a glance. "Why do this if you are not allied with me? I was told you served the pretender, Stannis Baratheon." A faint smile touched her lips, but it did not warm her eyes. "I once served Stannis because I believed he was the chosen champion of Lawler, the one destined to fight the coming darkness. Yet the flames revealed another possibility after the mists of the War of the Five Kings began to clear. They showed me a wolf crowned in ice, a man undone by treachery but resurrected by divine will to claim vengeance and unite the North for the battles yet to come. When word of your murder reached me, I knew I must act. The realm is not yet safe, Your Grace. Far worse threats loom than the petty squabbles of kings. We need a warrior chosen by fire and tempered by icy despair. We need you." Her tone was fervent, but measured, as though these were truths she had recited countless times in her prayers. Robb found himself unable to ignore the potency of her conviction. A red shadow flickered in her eyes, reminiscent of the flame that had coaxed him back from the dead. The memory of that all-encompassing darkness squeezed his heart, and he grimaced, pushing himself up onto his elbows. "Then the North needs me, and I shall not abandon it," he said, each word forging a renewed sense of purpose within him. "But I am still mortal. I can bleed, and I can be betrayed again. My body feels ruined." He glanced down at himself. He was stripped to the waist, his torso covered in stitches, bruises, and half-healed punctures. The dryness of his skin gave him the appearance of something freshly pulled from a grave. "How do I fight like this?" Melisandre stepped forward, arms outstretched. "Through devotion, through faith in the Lord of Light, but also through your own will, your grace. You are not returned merely as a shell. You have come back for a reason. The knowledge of betrayal burns in your mind, and from that flame you can forge yourself anew. You will heal, but you must do so quickly. Time is short." He clenched his jaw, determined to stand. Darren quickly came to his side, bracing him. Robb forced himself upright, ignoring the swirl of pain. Each heartbeat hammered in his ears. He feared he might collapse, yet some new strength thrummed in his veins, faint but present. He drew a shaky breath. "Then help me do it," he said, turning to Melisandre. "If you truly believe in my cause, help me avenge my family. Help me gather the North again. We will see the Freys pay for their treachery, and the Lannisters if they were behind it. Then we will do what must be done to save these lands from whatever threat you believe is coming." A ghost of a smile curved her lips, and she bowed her head as though in reverence. "As you command, your grace." In the days that followed, Robb hovered at the edge of death and delirium. His injuries, grievous enough to have slain any ordinary man, did not heal swiftly, but neither did they claim him. Melisandre's influence was both subtle and profound, lacing each bandage and poultice with oils and incantations. She chanted prayers into the brazier every evening, invoking Lawleress grace to banish infection and knit broken flesh. Darren and a small handful of loyal Northmen, those who had escaped the carnage at the Twins or had heard rumors of his survival, kept a tense vigil in the remote tower that served as their hideout. Robb's fever dreams were relentless. Night after night, he relived the Red Wedding. He saw his mother's hair matted to her face, eyes wild and vacant as she screamed in anguish. He felt the sting of crossbow bolts, the hot slick of blood saturating his tunic. Then, in a swirl of dark flames, the scenes would shift. He would see a vast wasteland of ice, endless and desolate, an army of the dead marching across the snows under a frozen sky. Shadows of monstrous shapes flickered across the horizon. Then a swirl of red light would surge, and he would see the silhouette of a giant wolf wreathed in flames, snapping at the heels of demons made of ice. He felt an unimaginable cold rushing toward him, and in its wake, all he could do was brace himself in terror. Inevitably, he woke trembling in a sweat, only to find Melisandre standing over him, watching him as though she too had witnessed the dreams. She said little of their meaning, only whispered that he must be strong, that he was chosen for more than a mortal war. Though he remembered how easily men were beguiled by superstitions, he found himself clinging to her every word in those hours of pain and confusion. Without her incantations, he doubted his patched-together body would last another day. Already he could feel his strength returning in unnatural surges. His wounds itched with the speed of mending, and in his mind, strategies began to form. A clear outline of everything that needed to be done, each step measured and precise. It was as though some hidden corner of his brain had awakened, a portion that had been tempered by death's embrace and gifted with a ruthlessness he had never before possessed. He had always been adept at tactics, a soldier's mind honed on the teachings of the maesters and the practicalities of war. But now, after his resurrection, He felt an uncanny clarity whenever he thought about the conflict to come. Every memory of the war's campaigns, every skirmish and standoff, every betrayal and allied maneuver, all seemed etched in luminous detail. When he closed his eyes, he saw entire battlefields laid out like puzzle boards. He saw the angles of approach, the distribution of supply lines, the morale of troops. A commanding presence grew inside him. A portion of the quiet gifts once attributed to his father combined with an intensity that seemed not his own. It was as if the flames had tempered him the way a blacksmith's forge tempered steel. He was still Robb Stark, but changed. He was driven by a raw fury hidden behind a calm veneer, a single-minded dedication that frightened him at times. Yet he also felt relief. No longer would he be the naive boy who let honor blind him to the shifting intrigues of lords and ladies. The memory of Walder Frey's smirk was enough to banish any illusion of mercy. He would not falter again. After weeks of recuperation, he gathered enough strength to move about on his own. He dressed in the clothes Darren and the others had scrounged. A rough-spun tunic, plain trousers, boots with the soles worn thin by long marches. Gone were the regal attire and the comforting presence of his direwolf. He had not dared to ask if Grey Wind's pelt survived, for fear he might do something mad with grief. Instead, he focused on the present. The ragtag group that hovered in the old tower had become a small community of believers in the King in the North Reborn. Some had once been standard-bearers under his banner, men from houses loyal to Winterfell. Others were deserters from armies grown weary of Tywin Lannister's manipulations. A few had traveled with Melisandre from Dragonstone, though their loyalty lay more with Lawler than any mortal king. Still, it was a start. He climbed the creaking stairs of the tower one early morning, leaning on the stone walls until he reached the top. There, a balcony opened out onto a view of rolling farmland stretching to the horizon, blanketed by the sallow light of dawn. The wind nipped at his face, carrying the tang of autumn. He caught the faintest whiff of something decaying, perhaps the remnants of scorched countryside from the wars that had ravaged the region. Melisandre stood on the balcony's edge, gazing at the sunrise, her crimson robes fluttering. She neither turned nor flinched at his approach. "We must move soon, Your Grace," she said, her voice lost in the wind. "The flames show me the Freys consolidating power in the Riverlands. They think they have snuffed out all who would oppose them. They rule by terror, but that rule can be disrupted if you present yourself." He joined her, bracing his hands on the crumbling stone ledge. "Then we ride," he said. "I want the Freys to tremble before the King in the North again, but not yet in open battle. We must be clever, strike where they are weak. Vengeance alone cannot guide you," she warned gently. "There is more at stake than petty retribution." He nodded, lips pressed thin. "I know," he said, surprising himself with his calm tone. "But they stand as a symbol of my family's downfall. They must be dealt with publicly and decisively, to prove that death will not silence House Stark." A flicker of approval crossed her face. "So be it." The following week was a flurry of hushed preparation. Robb worked closely with Darren and the other Northmen, gathering intelligence on the Frey's supply routes, scouting out their heavily fortified strongholds. He refused to rely solely on Melisandre's illusions of flame. Information gleaned from outriders and hidden sympathizers in the Riverlands was invaluable. Reports trickled in that many small folk cursed the Freys for their treachery. As soon as talk of Robb Stark's survival began to spread, always in whispers, half disbelieved, pockets of resistance grew bold enough to sabotage the Freys' caravans and sabotage their outriders. Each night, Robb tested the boundaries of his new body, training with sword, spear, and bow. The first few sessions were embarrassing. He stumbled, and his reflexes felt muddled by the weeks spent recovering. But he persevered, fueled by a drive that bordered on obsession. Pain was a constant companion, but Melisandre's salves and incantations eased the worst of it. The men who sparred with him remarked upon how uncanny his progress became after just a few days. His movements gained precision, as though the ghosts of every fight he'd ever participated in guided him from within. He corrected his stance, shifted his weight, and soon was moving through exercises of swordsmanship with a deadly grace that even he had not possessed before his death. He would not deny a quiet fear that flickered in his mind. Had he truly been brought back by a benevolent power, or had some darker influence claimed him? He sometimes felt surges of anger he barely recognized as his own, a cold fury that descended upon him in the midst of training. But if that fury aided him in reclaiming the North, perhaps it was a price he would pay without regret. Darin, who had become something of a lieutenant in this new order, approached Robb one evening while he practiced alone in the courtyard. "Your Grace," he said, hesitating on the edge of the torchlight. "Word has come from White Harbor. Lord Wyman Manderley seems prepared to rise again if he has proof you live. Manderley is cunning, and he hates the phrase nearly as much as you do. If we can secure White Harbor's navy and resources, we might have a foothold." Robb paused, sword tip scraping the dirt. Sweat matted his hair to his forehead. "We cannot reveal ourselves too soon, but Manderley, yes. He was always the most pragmatic of my lords. He might risk open defiance if he's convinced we can actually strike back." He sheathed his sword and straightened, grim satisfaction settling on his features. "Send a messenger. Don't give away my location, but let him know the king in the north is reborn, and that I will move swiftly against the frays. He should prepare. We'll need his ships to blockade the White Knife and cut off southern supply lines." Darin nodded and turned T. "Oh, go," but paused, glancing back at Robb with conflicted eyes. "Your Grace, are we certain we should trust these flames? This red woman?" The question pulled a half-smile to Robb's face, though it was tinged with sorrow. "We trust no one blindly, Darin, but she saved my life, and for now that is enough. I won't forget that we must guard ourselves, always. Still, the time will come when we need her powers more than ever, and I will not spurn her aid." He released a tired sigh. "We must be ready for anything." That readiness was tested soon enough. Scouts reported a Fry patrol traveling too close to the tower for comfort. Robb decided it was time to act. Under the cover of darkness, he and a handful of Northmen descended from their refuge, lying in wait among the thick woods lining the worn dirt road. Rain fell in drizzles, and the moon's pale glow cast shifting shadows as clouds drifted overhead. Robb settled behind a gnarled oak, his heartbeat slow and steady, his pulse thrumming with the anticipation of battle. He inhaled the damp scent of moss and wet leaves, letting himself remember the hunts he had once led with gray wind at his side. An ache burned in his throat at the memory. He touched the pommel of his sword, an unfamiliar blade they had scavenged from a storehouse. He missed his own steel, the one that had served him so well during his early victories. But sentiment would not bring the Freys to justice. The patrol arrived close to midnight, a half-dozen men mounted and heavily armed, carrying torches. They chatted idly, as if expecting no danger. Robb could practically smell the arrogance wafting off them. They were Freys, men grown to think themselves untouchable after the Red Wedding, convinced that every wolf had been run down. Predatory thrill coursed through him. He gave the signal with a small gesture of his hand, and the Northmen attacked. Arrows whistled through the gloom, finding the joints of armor. Horses shrieked, and men tumbled. Robb vaulted over a fallen log, sword drawn, eyes keen in the shifting torchlight. He bore down on the nearest Fry, who frantically raised a shield. Before the man could so much as shout, Robb's blade slid through the guard's shoulder, the strike sure and final. The Fry dropped, crimson staining his jerkin. Another man barreled into Robb's side, lashing at him with a mace. Robb twisted, letting the blow glance off his pauldron. Muscles tensed and coiled as he pivoted, driving his sword beneath the man's ribs with ruthless efficiency. In the swirl of chaos, he noticed how clear his thoughts remained, how each strike felt guided by a sense of inevitability. The meaty smack of steel in flesh was a savage reminder of all he'd lost. He took no pleasure in it, only a grim resolve. When the final Fry fell, silence returned, broken only by the labored breathing of the Northmen. Rain pattered, torches guttered in the mud. Robb stood in the midst of the carnage, chest heaving. He stared down at the dead men, their eyes open in shocked disbelief, as though they'd seen a ghost. Perhaps they had. He felt the sting of a gash along his arm but paid it no mind. The pain drowned in adrenaline. Daeron approached, breath frosted in the cold night air. "We should hide the bodies." Robb nodded. "Burn them or bury them, I don't care. But do it quietly. We can't have the Freys learning that their patrol was slaughtered by the ghost of the king in the north. At least not yet." Their small band melted away into the darkness, leaving behind only rain-washed bloodstains and a sense of foreboding. That confrontation was a first step, a test of Robb's renewed prowess and a warning to the Freys that something stirred in the shadows. Soon, there would be no hiding the truth of his resurrection. The entire realm would learn he had not stayed in his grave. But until then, he had more pressing concerns. Forging alliances, rebuilding his power, and preparing for the day he would openly declare himself once again. In the following weeks, messages flitted across the Riverlands and the north, quietly calling banners to a renewed cause. Word reached the Brotherhood without banners, who had once roamed these lands fighting injustice. Outlaws and small folk alike whispered that a great change was coming. Walder Frey's bannermen scoffed at the rumors, dismissing them as the superstitious mutterings of peasants. They pointed to the decapitated body of Grey Wind that had once been paraded around, the severed head sewn onto Robb's own corpse. It was impossible, they said, for the young wolf to walk again. Yet whispers persisted, and unrest festered. Isolated Frey outposts in the Riverlands found themselves beset by roving attacks under the cover of night. The attackers moved with coordination, never lingering, striking like a pack of wolves before melting away into the forests. Some swore they'd seen a tall warrior with fiery eyes leading these skirmishes, his sword cutting men down as though guided by fate itself. At first, the Freys refused to believe the rumors, but as body after body turned up, fear crept in. Uncertainty threatened to unravel their hold on the region. Robb sent Daeron to White Harbor, bearing a personal letter and a token, the signet ring of House Stark. He spent a sleepless night drafting the missive, ensuring that Lord Wyman Manderly would recognize the truth in every word. He confessed the circumstances of his resurrection only in the most guarded manner, claiming that the gods had granted him a second chance to fulfill his duty to the north. He ended with an impassioned appeal for Manderly's support. Ships, troops, gold, whatever could be spared to launch a strike at the Freys. There was no mention of Melisandre or the power of R'hllor. That secret Robb kept close, even as he realized it was likely the worst-kept secret among those in his immediate circle. Meanwhile, Melisandre continued to haunt the tower, watching flames burn in the brazier. At times, Robb found her reciting incantations late into the night, her eyes distant as though she saw events unfolding far beyond these walls. She claimed to have glimpses of White Walkers, their ranks swelling in the frigid north. She warned that the Night's Watch was weakening, that Winterfell itself might be in danger from both the undead and more tangible foes. Robb listened grimly. Every day, he felt the press of time urging him to move faster, secure alliances, and retake control of the north before the true war arrived. He was no longer naive enough to think the politics of the Seven Kingdoms were separate from the looming doom in the far north. His nights were restless. When he closed his eyes, he heard his mother's final scream, saw Grey Wind's muzzle soaked in blood. Yet behind that heartbreak lay a raging inferno of purpose. He had been chosen, by whom or what he still could not fully accept. But if the cost of being chosen was all that grief and suffering, he would at least ensure it served a greater end. The boy inside him, who once dreamed of chivalry and justice, was gone. In his place stood a man burdened by sorrow, tempered by death, and sharpened by the flames of resurrection. At last, word returned from White Harbor. A coded message found its way into Robb's hands through secret couriers, men willing to die rather than risk the letter falling into Frey or Lannister hands. He read it in private, his brow furrowing with intensity. Lord Wyman Manderly wrote that he was outraged beyond measure at the Frey's betrayal and that he believed in his heart the king in the north had found some path to life once more. Manderly pledged to do all in his power to support Robb, clandestinely at first, for the Freys had ears everywhere. But Manderly's fleets would be prepared to move at Robb's command, and men loyal to House Stark would soon be marching in secret, ready to strike a decisive blow. The letter's promises lifted Robb's spirits. He wasted no time in planning. He assembled his most trusted men in the tower's largest chamber, a cramped room lined with musty tapestries. Melisandre stood at his side, silent but watchful. Spread out on a wooden table was a map of the Riverlands, dotted with tokens representing Frey garrisons, rumored loyalist enclaves, and possible sympathetic villages. Robb traced a finger along the highways leading to the Twins, where Walder Frey perched like a spider in his web. "We have to control the surrounding territory before we strike the Twins directly," he said, his tone clipped with determination. "Manderly can move troops up the White Knife, pinning any Frey forces in the east. My loyalists still hidden in the north can gather under Manderly's banner. Meanwhile, we'll harass Frey supply lines from the south and west. We'll starve them into desperation, cut off reinforcements. Eventually, even the Twins can be made vulnerable if we isolate it properly." One of the Northmen, a grizzled veteran named Hally's Hornwood, tapped the map near Seaguard. "We can also seek the help of the Mallisters. The Freys once had tenuous alliances there, but after the Red Wedding, nobody with honor wants to keep faith with them." Robb nodded. "Yes, quietly sound out Lord Mallister's stance. We cannot trust open alliances until we're certain who stands with us. But if he is willing, we can coordinate strikes on Frey caravans passing near the coast." He glanced around the circle of men, each face reflecting a mix of excitement and concern. They were outnumbered, outfunded, and hardly in a position to wage open war. Yet they had Robb Stark, the resurrected king in the north, and they had a cunning strategy that relied on precision, stealth, and the outrage of lords who chafed under Frey tyranny. It would be enough, or so they had to believe. Darren stood at attention, arms crossed. "What of the Tullis?" he asked quietly. "Edmure's a prisoner at the Twins. Do we try to free him?" Robb swallowed, a wave of grief for his mother and the entire Tully line washing over him. "If we can," he said, voice soft, "but we cannot risk the entire plan to rescue one man, even if he's my uncle. Our priority is retaking control of the region. If the opportunity presents itself, we seize it. Otherwise," he trailed off, the weight of harsh choices bearing down on him. In the hush that followed, Melisandre's voice cut through the tension. "The flames show me blood and ice entwined in the days to come. Our success hinges on your resolve, your grace. Every doubt is a crack the enemy can exploit. Do not waver." Robb glanced at her, surprised by the directness of the comment. "I won't," he said, and though a part of him still harbored doubts about many things, he knew he would never hesitate in his mission to reclaim the North. "We march soon. We start small, capturing a Frey outpost near the crossroads. That will be our foothold." So the war began anew. Robb's band, growing in number each day, struck at the edges of Frey territory in swift, punishing raids. They ambushed reinforcements, seized caravans carrying grain and supplies, freed small pockets of prisoners who despised their Frey captors. In every battle, Robb fought at the forefront, unwilling to hide behind a protective circle of guards. If he were truly chosen, truly resurrected for a purpose, then leading from the front lines seemed the only proper course. His men rallied around him, their morale rising as rumors of the king in the north's return spread from village to village. Walder Frey's brood responded with brutal crackdowns, executing suspected traitors among the peasants. Spies scurried across the land, hunting for any sign of Robb's main encampment. But Robb employed a cunning web of misdirection. He frequently changed camp locations, rotating squads, giving his men code phrases that would reveal any infiltrators. By day, they moved stealthily, and by night, they struck like wolves. Each victory, no matter how small, chipped away at the Frey's sense of invulnerability. Before long, the Riverlands stirred with rumors that Robb Stark was indeed alive, forging a new alliance to crush House Frey. Some swore they had seen him wearing a cloak of wolf pelts, standing amidst the aftermath of a night raid, the corpses of Frey soldiers scattered at his feet. Others claimed he carried a great sword wreathed in crimson fire, though such a rumor was likely the embellishment of frightened imaginations. Regardless, the whispered stories took on a life of their own, fueled by the desperate hope of small folk who longed for a leader to end the Frey tyranny. And all the while, Melisandre lingered at his side. She spoke less frequently now, as though satisfied that Robb had found his path. On rare occasions, he caught her gazing upon him with something like awe, but also with an undercurrent of calculation. He wondered what secrets she kept hidden in her heart. He suspected her devotion to her god eclipsed her devotion to his cause, yet their interests currently aligned. If that alliance ever frayed, it could bring about a conflict he was not eager to face. Months passed in a blur of strikes and feints, negotiations and espionage. The crisp chill of winter began to creep into the winds that swept across the riverlands, and the nights grew long. Robb's forces swelled with Northmen slipping south after hearing rumors of his return. Lord Manderly sent scouts and small detachments to coordinate with Robb's men, setting traps for Frey supply vessels on the rivers. Skirmishes escalated into pitched battles. Though the Freys outnumbered him, they proved cumbersome, weighed down by their own arrogance and the hostility of the people. Finally, the day came when Robb seized his first significant stronghold, a forgotten castle on a rocky rise near a fork in the river, manned by a lesser branch of Freys. The fortress was more of a fortified manor than a real castle, but it housed valuable armaments and controlled a vital crossing point. Robb's forces surrounded it under the cover of night, slipping through the darkness in small groups. The gate was sabotaged from within by local sympathizers, and when dawn broke, the king in the north's men poured inside. The Frey garrison collapsed into panic, their commander slain by a single arrow that caught him as he tried to rally his men. Robb personally led the final charge. His sword rose and fell in a deadly dance, his once weak muscles now honed and tireless. A dozen Frey men-at-arms broke before him, terrified by the rumors of his unholy resurrection. His eyes blazed with a fury that left them quaking. By mid-morning, the castle was his, and the banner of the wolf flew from the ramparts for the first time since the Red Wedding. When the terrified small folk emerged from hiding, they found Robb Stark covered in grime and blood, but wearing a tired smile of grim satisfaction. No sooner had the fortress fallen than Melisandre sought him out. She strode across the courtyard, her robes swishing around her ankles. Blood stained the stone at her feet. "It has begun, your grace," she said, as though her flames had revealed all of this in detail. "Now the realm will see that you are not a specter, but a living king, one who will stop at nothing to reclaim his birthright." Robb sank onto a low stone bench, wiping sweat from his brow. "We have a long road yet to travel," he said. "Walder Frey still holds the twins. He has alliances with the Lannisters, though weaker now that Tywin is gone. My sister Sansa is a captive in King's Landing, or was. News is scarce, and there's the Bolton threat in the north. They backed the Freys as well, and it was Roose Bolton who likely orchestrated the betrayal." "Bolton is cunning," Melisandre agreed, "and he has a bastard at the Dreadfort, one who is said to be as vicious as any wild beast. They must be dealt with in time." He rubbed at the faint scar tissue on his chest, feeling a flicker of gratitude that his heart still beat. "We must prepare carefully," he said, rising to face her. "But if my father taught me anything, it's that the North remembers, and it will not stand forever under traitors. In time, we shall march to retake Winterfell, drive out the Boltons, and unite every loyal Northman under our cause. Then no force, no Frey, no Lannister, not even a legion of whites, will keep me from fulfilling my duty." Melisandre's eyes flickered with an intensity that mirrored his. "And when the long night comes, your fury shall be the flame that holds it at bay." Robb wanted to scoff at her sometimes, to dismiss the prophecies and speak only of the immediate war. Yet those half-remembered dreams of an undead legion weighed on him. He thought of his brother Jon, sworn to the Night's Watch. Perhaps there was some truth in the warnings of White Walkers. A part of him felt drawn to that future confrontation as though it were already etched into his bones. For now, though, there were battles to fight in the realm of the living. He had reclaimed a foothold, proven his resurrection was no rumor. The wolves were gathering. The Freys cowered in their halls, uncertain how to respond to this unstoppable shadow from their worst nightmares. Slowly, methodically, Robb Stark was turning the tide, and each victory hardened his resolve. He spent the next days consolidating control of the newly captured fortress, now garrisoned by loyal Northmen and Riverlanders. Captured Frey arms and supplies were distributed among his forces. He formed new squads of scouts to range far and wide, ensuring no approach would take them by surprise. Some of the local peasants and hedge knights trickled in, offering their oaths of fealty if he would promise an end to Frey tyranny. In the evenings, Robb would wander the battlements alone, looking out across the cold expanse of the river below. The sun would sink, painting the sky in dusky purples and reds, and he would hear faint echoes of the feasts of old, of music and laughter that once filled the halls of Winterfell. A wave of ache would roll through him. He missed his mother. He missed Grey Wind. He missed the simpler days when he was just a boy learning to be a man under Ned Stark's quiet guidance. But that life was gone, murdered by the Freys, the Boltons, and Lannister Gold. He reminded himself that the boy he once was died at the Twins. Now, in his stead, walked a king reborn by strange fire and unwavering will. Perhaps the Lord of Light had chosen him. Perhaps he was only a pawn in a larger game. Either way, he could not falter. Even if all the conspiracies of White Walkers and ancient prophecies amounted to naught, he owed it to his family's memory to see justice done. Daeron approached him on one such evening, wind ripping across the battlements, ruffling their cloaks. "Your Grace," he said, his voice raised above the wind. "A raven arrived from one of our agents near the Twins. It seems Walder Frey has grown paranoid, doubling the guard on every gate. He's recalled some of his kin from scattered posts, consolidating them. He fears an open siege." Robb nodded, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Good. Let him tremble behind his walls." He leaned on the stone merlin, eyes scanning the distance. "What news of Uncle Edmure?" "No change. Still a hostage in the Twins, threatened with death if the Tullus so much as blink out of line. Also word is that a Lannister envoy was spotted traveling to the Twins. We don't know the purpose." Robb ground his teeth in frustration. "Likely to negotiate further support or tribute from Walder Frey. We have to make our move soon, before they can fortify themselves further with Lannister gold and men. If the Twins become too impenetrable, we may be forced into a protracted siege we can ill afford." Daeron bowed his head. "We stand ready, Your Grace. Just say the word." Robb stared out into the gathering twilight, thinking. The Twins were formidable, bridging the Green Fork River with two massive fortresses. To capture it directly would be a monumental task, even with the cunning strategies that now seemed second nature to him. But he also knew that if the Freys were truly isolated, cut off from the north by Manderly's forces and from the south by the Malisters, they would eventually run out of supplies. Still, Edmure Tully's life hung in the balance, and each day that passed risked further atrocities. Eventually, he sighed, turning to Daeron. "We'll wait for Manderly's next contingent of men. When they arrive, we begin closing the noose around the Twins in earnest. Target their outposts, starve them, sow discord among their minor lords. Once we see an opening, we strike. But let's be clear, we take Walder Frey alive if we can. I want him to stand judgment for the Red Wedding." A flicker of fierce satisfaction crossed Daeron's face. "It will be done, Your Grace." After the man left, Robb lingered on the battlements a while longer. He felt the cold air biting at his cheeks, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the sensation of the north wash over him. Winter was coming, both literally and figuratively, and he would be damned if he didn't ensure House Stark had a say in how the season would unfold. That night, he slept fitfully, jostled by nightmares of the Red Wedding. At one point, he found himself kneeling in a flooded hall, water lapping at his chest, thick with bodies. Floating across the surface were the faces of those he'd loved. His mother, Grey Wind, even his father. They stared blankly at him, mouths open as if screaming voicelessly. Then a swirl of red flames erupted, and from the fire stepped Melisandre, her eyes brighter than the sun. She reached for him, and the world exploded in sparks. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, hand clenched on the dagger he kept by his bedside. The dream clung to him as he rose and dressed before dawn. Felt like a warning. He found Melisandre in the courtyard, already engaged in one of her silent rituals, the brazier's coals glowing in the half-light. The air smelled of burnt cedar and incense. She did not look up as he approached, nor did she stop murmuring her prayers. He watched her for a moment, unsure if he should interrupt. When she finally finished, she turned, her expression calm. "The dawn brings truth, your grace," she said quietly. "You are troubled." He let out a breath. "Is it that obvious? I can see the tension in your face, and there is a trembling in the flame that suggests some disquiet in your spirit." He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I dreamed of them again, all the dead, drifting in water, faces contorted by betrayal. I fear that I bear some curse, some condemnation for the lives lost. Perhaps I was never meant to return." Melisandre reached out, placing a hand on his forehead the way a mother might soothe a fevered child. "We do not choose whom the Lord of Light brings back. He saw a purpose in you, Robb Stark. Destiny is never without its ghosts. They will haunt you until you fulfill your role." He studied her face, searching for any crack in her poise. He found none. There was only unwavering conviction. Slowly, he took a step back. "Then I'd best ensure I do not fail," he said, squaring his shoulders. "Because if I'm to carry this burden, I want it to mean something. I want justice for them all, my people, my family, and if there is a greater threat beyond the wall, as you claim, then I will meet it with the steel of the North behind me." A fleeting smile touched her lips, spoken like a true king. The pace of events quickened. Manderly sent more men, discreetly funneling them into Robb's expanding territory in the Riverlands. The Freys lashed out, sallying from their strongholds to try and squash Robb's forces in open battle. But Robb never gave them the chance to fight on their terms. He laid traps in the marshy lowlands, used feints to split their armies, then crushed isolated detachments with a ferocity that left survivors trembling. Soon, some of Walder Frey's bannermen began deserting, unwilling to face the unstoppable king in the north. The Frey network of alliances, once so strong, began to fracture under the relentless strain. All this time, Robb worked tirelessly, forging a reputation that was both terrifying and inspiring. His men followed him with near-fanatical loyalty, for he shared in their hardships and never asked them to face dangers he himself would not endure. The small folk flocked to his banner, seeing in him a figure of legend resurrected by the gods to exact vengeance on traitors. The truth of his resurrection, though shrouded in rumor, only added to his mystique. Some even began calling him the Wolf Reborn. He took little pleasure in the adulation, haunted by the knowledge of how easily it could slip away if he faltered. But he used it all the same, for a king needed every advantage in a realm as unforgiving as Westeros. One crisp morning, scouts brought him news that Walder Frey had summoned a large host to protect the twins. Thousands of men were mustering, including many reluctant swords coerced by threats or extorted through old feudal obligations. In short, Walder was making his final stand. If Robb and his allies did not move soon, the twins would become a fortress from which Walder could outlast the winter. Robb assembled his leaders, reviewing the intelligence meticulously. The fortress hall echoed with their low voices, each man leaning over a table strewn with maps. Braziers crackled, warding off the chill that seeped through the stone walls. "This is our chance," Robb said, tapping the map with a dagger's tip. "We strike before his host can fully organize. We block the main roads, ensuring no relief can come from the south. Manderly's fleet will hold the White Knife to the north. Walder will be bottled up in the Twins with limited supplies." Hallie's Hornwood nodded. "We have 2 or 3 weeks at most before the Lannisters possibly send assistance. Cersei might dispatch a force to uphold the Frey alliance. if only to prevent your resurgence from spreading. Robb's jaw clenched at the mention of Lannisters. Then we do not dawdle. Manderly's men will siege from the north bank. We will take the south bank. Once we have them pinned, we send a final demand for surrender. Walder will not comply, but it will sow confusion among his men, especially those who are only fighting for him out of fear. Then we break them. Melisandre stood silent in a corner, eyes fixed on the brazier, as though reading some hidden script in the flames. Robb finished detailing the plan, issuing orders for the distribution of troops, the placement of archers, and fallback contingencies. Every angle had been carefully considered. A testament to the sharpened strategic mind the Red Woman's intervention seemed to have awakened in him. Finally, the lords and captains departed to prepare. Darin stayed behind, tension etched into his features. "Your Grace," he said, "my men are ready. We've come so far for this. Let us finish it." "We will," Robb assured him. "And then, when the twins are ours, Walder Frey will answer for every drop of blood he spilled." They marched at dawn, a disciplined host of Northmen, Riverlanders, and allies from White Harbor. Though not as large as the armies Robb once commanded, these men were seasoned, hardened by guerrilla warfare and galvanized by faith in a resurrected king. Their banners fluttered in the wind. The gray direwolf of House Stark, the merman of House Manderly, even a handful of Tully trout from those Riverrun knights who still remembered their oaths. The land around the twins was bleak in late autumn, the grass turning brittle underfoot. The two fortress towers loomed, one on each bank, joined by a bridge spanning the Green Fork. Anyone wishing to cross the river had to come through Walder Frey's domain, or break the ancient alliance with House Frey. But that alliance had long since been shattered. Robb's heart pounded as the iconic shape of the twins came into view. Memories swamped him. Arriving there under the naive assumption that Walder Frey could be trusted, the heartbreak that followed. Now he returned at the head of an army, bent on obliterating the man who had orchestrated the darkest betrayal the North had ever known. They arrayed their forces along the southern bank, siege engines rumbling into position. Manderly's banners appeared on the northern horizon, forming a formidable line that closed off any escape. Trumpets sounded. The Freys realized too late that they were surrounded. A flurry of activity erupted on the ramparts, banners snapping in haste. Robb dispatched envoys offering a chance to avoid a bloodbath. Surrender Edmure Tully, throw Walder Frey into custody, and open the gates. The men delivering the message later returned with arrows lodged in their shields. Walder's response. An eerie calm settled over the battlefield. Robb took position on a rise overlooking the southern tower, from which he could orchestrate the attack. In his mind, he saw each potential move the Freys might make. He pictured the arrangement of archers, boiling pitch, and possible sally ports. The knowledge steeled him. His men waited, the tension coiling like a drawn bowstring. "Sound the attack," Robb commanded. Horns blared, echoing across the river. A thunderous roar rose from the assembled army. Ranks of archers advanced, loosing volleys that soared in graceful arcs over the battlements. Frey crossbowmen returned fire. The air hummed with the hiss of missiles. Screams erupted where bolts found flesh. Siege towers rolled forward, thick planks creaking under their massive weight. Ladders were hoisted. Stones catapulted by trebuchets smashed into the walls, sending shards of mortar flying. Robb watched it unfold with a detached clarity. He motioned for certain squads to advance or retreat, shifting the lines with expert precision to exploit weaknesses. Whenever Frey soldiers tried to sally from a gate, he anticipated their maneuvers, sending cavalry to scatter them. Along the northern bank, Manderly's men mirrored his actions, preventing any escape or reinforcements. The day stretched on in a swirl of blood and dust. The moat around the towers turned murky with debris. Bodies littered the field, yet Robb's forces steadily pushed closer, scaling the lower ramparts. At times, the Freys tried to push the siege towers back, but their leadership was disorganized. Walder Frey himself was nowhere to be seen, likely cowering in the safety of the upper chambers. When the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a ruddy light across the carnage, Robb saw the turning point. A section of the southern tower's wall cracked under repeated bombardment, chunks of stone giving way. Northmen rushed the breach with battle cries that sent the defenders reeling. Robb mounted his horse, rallying a cavalry contingent, and led them around to flank the main gate. The gates were battered, half-splintered, and under renewed pressure they collapsed inward, revealing a courtyard teeming with desperate Frey men-at-arms. "Forward!" Robb shouted, spurring his horse. The thunder of hooves filled his ears as he and his men crashed into the courtyard. The clash of steel and screams was deafening. Robb hacked down a soldier, parried a spear thrust, and pressed onward. His mind was an icy calm amidst the frenzy. He moved like a man possessed, each strike purposeful, each dodge calculated. His sword arm ached, but he persisted. Blood sprayed across his mail. Arrows whirred overhead. The clamor of the fighting was surreal, like a half-remembered dream of chaos. He caught a glimpse of the keep's interior, blazing with torchlight. Archers rained arrows from balconies. Robb signaled for his own archers to return fire. Everywhere he looked, the defenders faltered, overshadowed by the unyielding assault. Gradually, the swirl of battle moved deeper into the fortress. Courtyards and hallways became killing fields. The Freys still held the upper floors, but that wouldn't last forever. On the northern tower, Manderly's forces had breached as well, though they faced fiercer resistance. Smoke plumed, drifting across the bridge that connected the two towers. Frey soldiers tried to collapse the span, but loyal engineers managed to keep it intact just long enough for Robb's men to cross, reinforcing the northern assault. By nightfall, the entire fortress complex echoed with savage conflict. Torchfire danced on blood-stained stones. The shrieks of the dying mingled with the roars of victors. Robb pressed forward into the northern tower, determined to find Walder Frey. The corridors were choked with corpses, furniture overturned in makeshift barricades. Resistance pockets sprang up, only to be crushed under the unstoppable momentum of the besiegers. At last, Robb reached a large hall, the very one that had been decked out in feasting tables the night of the Red Wedding. A chill seized him as he recognized it. The memory of that betrayal, the ghostly strains of the Rains of Castamere, was enough to stoke his fury to new heights. He and his men stormed the hall, where a cluster of Frey knights formed a final defensive line. Robb fought as though possessed by a vengeful spirit, cutting them down one by one. Somewhere behind their ranks, he saw Walder Frey, pale and trembling, surrounded by a handful of guards. The old man's eyes were wide, darting back and forth as though seeking an exit. Robb's lips pulled back from his teeth in a snarl. "Walder Frey!" he shouted, voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Face the king in the north." One of the knights lunged, trying to keep Robb from his lord. Robb sidestepped the blow, disarmed the knight with a quick slash, and kicked him aside. Another guard rushed him, but was taken down by a spear thrown from behind. One of Robb's men, perhaps Darren. The lines collapsed, leaving Walder Frey exposed. The old man's face contorted with terror. His jowls quivered. The stench of fear radiated from him. Robb advanced, sword raised. "You murdered my family under the guise of hospitality," he said, voice low and thick with rage. "You broke sacred oaths. You spat on the gods. And now you will answer for it." Walder Frey shuffled backwards, stumbling over a fallen body. "Mercy," he croaked, his voice trembling. "Spare me, and I can make you rich. Richer than you can imagine." Robb sneered. "There is no mercy for the likes of you." He glanced at the men surrounding them, each face reflecting years of hatred for the Freys. "Seize him," Robb commanded. "Throw him in the dungeon. He'll answer for his crimes before all the lords of Westeros, if they're willing to watch. Let them see what justice means to House Stark." The soldiers rushed forward, dragging Walder Frey away. The old man screamed futile threats and pleas. Robb turned, letting his gaze sweep the hall. The last pockets of resistance were either dead or subdued. The twins belonged to the king in the north. Shouts of victory echoed through the corridors. Somewhere, men roared in celebration, though the stench of blood made it a hollow triumph in Robb's mind. He sheathed his sword, his chest heaving. He had taken his vengeance, recaptured the very place where his life had ended. Yet he felt no euphoria, only a grim satisfaction that one chapter of his debt had been paid. A hush fell over him as he pictured his mother's face, her final plea for mercy unheeded by these traitors. At least now, Walder Frey's time had come. As he strode from the hall, he noticed Melisandre standing in the shadows, her eyes fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. Blood spattered her robes, though he knew she'd cast no spells this night. She had not needed to. His anger and cunning had been more than enough. "You have done what needed to be done," she said softly. "But steel yourself, your grace. This war is far from over." He exhaled, nodding. "I know." He looked around at the ruined fortress. "We'll fortify the twins under Stark control. We'll free my uncle Edmure. And soon we will march north, back to Winterfell, to face Roose Bolton and his bastard. Then, once the north is ours again, we'll look to the wall. If the threat you warn of is real, we'll be the shield that guards the realms of men." The red woman's lips curved. "And so the blade is forged." He felt an odd resonance in her words, as though they confirmed something deep within him. He had stepped beyond his old life. He had crossed a threshold of death and betrayal. Now, with the phrase undone, he could sense the path ahead. Uniting the North, preparing for a war that would dwarf all others. It was a burden that might break him, but he was no longer alone, and he was no longer the naive young man who had once trusted too easily. He was Robb Stark, the king in the North reborn, and he would not fail again. So the siege ended, and the banners of House Stark rose over the twins. Soldiers embraced in the courtyards, singing songs of victory. Freed prisoners wept in relief, offering fervent thanks to the man they called the Wolf Reborn. The dreadful memories of the Red Wedding lingered, but now those halls had been reclaimed. Walder Frey's reign of terror was finished, and Robb Stark, still haunted by the ghosts of those he loved, still bearing the scars of death's embrace, turned his gaze northward. Winter was coming, and he intended to meet it head-on. Sword in hand, wits sharpened, and a fire burning in his soul that not even the coldest night could extinguish. Robb Stark did not linger long in the blood-smeared hall of his rebirth. The echoes of steel against steel still rang from the corridors. The smell of ash and fear clung to every stone. Yet the twins, that once unassailable symbol of Frey treachery, now belonged to the king in the north. Walder Frey had been dragged away shrieking. His heirs were dead, captured, or fled into the night, scattering like roaches from a kicked-over nest. The sullen autumn sun hovered low beyond the windows, shedding an anemic light on a courtyard piled with the fallen. He stood with his sword in hand a moment longer, breath coiling before him in the cold air. Hours of combat weighed on his arms and legs, but no weariness touched his mind. Instead, a focused, steely calm ruled him, as though the heat of battle had only sharpened his senses. The men around him, Northmen, Riverlanders, a few knights sworn to House Manderly, watched him in a silence that spoke volumes. He sensed their awe, their relief, and beneath it all, a bone-deep reverence that bordered on fear. His resurrection, the quiet rumors of sorcery, the unstoppable ferocity of his campaign. It all wove into a tapestry of legend that swirled around him like a cloak. But legend or no, Robb was still flesh and blood. Beneath his mail and battered leathers, scars tugged painfully at newly knitted flesh. Sweat stung the half-healed punctures from crossbow bolts that had once killed him. Each day he remembered the old agonies, a reminder that, chosen by some power though he might be, he was not invincible. When he finally sheathed his sword, the men seemed to let out a collective breath. Darren of House Locke stepped forward, splattered in grime but grinning with the triumph of victory. "Your Grace," he said, voice hushed in the half-ruined hall. "We've taken most of the Frey loyalists alive. A few pockets of resistance remain on the upper floors, but they'll not last the night." Robb nodded. "See that no more pointless blood is spilled. If they surrender, keep them breathing. The North remembers who betrayed us, but we'll show them an honor tea. They never showed us. A wave of acknowledgement passed over Darren's face. Mercy was not the theme of this night, yet Robb would not stoop to the same butchery that had once been visited on him and his kin. The phrase would stand trial, if only to let all the realm witness their condemnation. The men around Robb muttered agreement. It was clear that none held affection for House Fry, but they respected their king's commands as though spelled out in stone. Melisandre's presence weighed on him at the periphery of his vision. Slight in stature, robed in scarlet, with eyes that seemed to glow like coals. He felt her more than saw her. She watched in silence, offering no smile of celebration, no sign of relief. Perhaps her red god had long ago revealed this victory to her, so that she saw no cause for surprise. Or perhaps she kept her thoughts guarded, reading deeper truths in every flicker of torchlight on bloody walls. He forced himself to push beyond such mysteries. Duty awaited. "My uncle," he said to Darren, a tremor in his voice at the memory of Edmure Tully held hostage. "Find him. This was the hall where I last saw him. They must be keeping him somewhere within these towers." At once, men scattered to fulfill their king's order. Robb, accompanied by a handful of loyal guards, strode into the corridors that wound through the fortress. The floors were slick with gore, and the smell of spent torches mingled with the stench of death. At each intersection, they found more prisoners being led away, wounded Fry soldiers with vacant eyes, their expressions stumbling somewhere between terror and disbelief. Hadn't they boasted for months that the king in the north was dead? Yet here he was in living flesh, claiming their ancestral seat as though it were a mere stepping stone on his path to vengeance. They searched through door after door, many of which were flung open in haste when the defenders fled. In a dim antechamber that reeked of stale bread and rancid meat, they discovered Edmure Tully. He lay on a pallet of straw, battered and haggard, his wrists manacled. At the sight of Robb's face, Edmure sat bolt upright, eyes wide with shock that flirted with delirium. "Robb!" Edmure's voice cracked. He'd been starved, by the look of him, his cheeks sunken, his eyes ringed with bruises. "Am I dreaming? Is this?" Robb knelt beside him, waving the guards over. "You're not dreaming, uncle." Quiet urgency threaded his tone. "You're safe now." He reached for the chain around Edmure's wrists, fumbling with the heavy lock until one of the Northmen found a key on a corpse in the corridor. The manacles clattered away, freeing Edmure's swollen hands. Robb saw the bruises, the cuts that lined his uncle's arms, signs of captivity under Walder Frey's sadistic brood. Edmure blinked furiously, as though struggling to confirm that the man before him was real. Then, in a sudden rush, he seized Robb's hand. "They told me you were dead," he rasped. "Everyone said the Red Wedding had finished you. That... My gods, Robb, your mother." A shudder ran through Robb. Grief threatened to surge anew, but he had honed himself in the crucible of purpose. He pressed Edmure's fingers gently. "She's gone," he murmured, "but I remain, and the phrase will pay for every drop of blood spilt. Starting now." Silent tears shone in Edmure's eyes. He bowed his head, exhaling as though a weight were melting from his chest. Robb helped him to his feet, and they supported him out of the filthy chamber into the cooler corridor. There, a handful of men-at-arms straightened at the sight of the Tully lord, offering respectful nods. Some recognized Edmure from the days when Riverrun still stood free and proud. Darren arrived at a brisk pace, reporting that the last holdouts on the upper floors had either fled or surrendered. He had posted men to secure the battlements, and Manderly's forces were rummaging through the northern tower to check for hidden traps or caches of Fry defenders. When Robb nodded in acknowledgement, Darren's gaze slid to Edmure, and a flicker of pity crossed his features. "We'll get a maester to tend his injuries," Darren said quietly. "He looks like he's been living in the dungeon for weeks." Edmure tried to muster a smile. "I have. They dragged me out now and again to threaten me with a beheading whenever I objected to their demands." His gaze fixed on Robb with a measure of the old Tully pride. "I told them they'd rue every blow they struck, But I confess, I never dreamed I'd see you again." Robb frowned, remembering how hopeless it had felt when he first learned of Edmure's capture. "The gods, or some power beyond them, gave me a second chance," he said softly. "Let us use it wisely." With Edmure freed and Walder Frey in chains, the day's bloodshed at last wound to a close. Robb ordered a careful watch placed on the battered fortress. His men carried the wounded, friend and foe alike, to the upper halls that would serve as makeshift infirmaries. The dead, of which there were many, found their rest in a row outside the walls, awaiting pyres or burial. Robb stood among the debris, listening to the moans of injured men and the distant crackle of torches, all while grappling with the magnitude of what he had done. He had reclaimed the twins. He refused to spend that night in the hall where the Red Wedding had taken place, refusing even to cross its threshold. Instead, he held a brief war council in a smaller solar that had once belonged to one of Walder Frey's many sons. There, with a tattered map spread across a heavy oak table, Robb outlined the next steps. Manderley's captains stood close by, as did several loyal Northmen and lords of the Riverlands. In a corner, Edmure Tully sat on a padded chair, half dozing in exhaustion but determined to bear witness. Melisandre hovered near a brazier, her scarlet robes draped like living flame in the flickering firelight. Robb placed a gauntlet hand on the map. "We hold the twins. That alone changes the balance of power in the Riverlands. Walder Frey is defeated and in our custody, but we still have to secure Riverrun, Harrenhal, and the roads leading north. The Lannisters won't let this stand unchallenged, nor will the Boltons. They're counting on the north to remain divided." A tall knight wearing the badge of House Manderley, 3 merman heads on a field of blue-green, cleared his throat. "Lord Wyman has men stationed in White Harbor, ready to blockade the White Knife. If the Boltons try to march south to challenge us, they'll have to come through Moat Cailin or cross the neck some other way. And that crossing is notoriously treacherous in winter." Robb nodded, swirling lines of strategy forming in his mind. "Good. We'll send riders to White Harbor soon. But first, we must decide what to do with Walder Frey." He flicked his gaze around the table. "He deserves a trial, a public reckoning for the Red Wedding, so that no one can claim we took vengeance in secrecy or doubt his guilt. But we must hold that trial in a place where it will resonate." "Winterfell," suggested Darren. "Or Riverrun, in honor of your mother's family." A hush fell. Edmure stirred, glancing at Robb with weary eyes. "Riverrun is under siege by the remnants of Frey and Lannister forces. They forced my vassals to surrender or starve, and I doubt many hold illusions of loyalty to the Freys anymore. If you free my castle and hold the trial there, it would be a powerful symbol." Robb weighed the thought. Riverrun was dear to his mother's memory. Reclaiming it would both reassert Tully authority and punish the traitors. "Agreed," he said. "We'll move soon. While we do that, we'll prepare our push north. Moat Cailin must fall before we can retake Winterfell from the Boltons. I won't let them keep my family's seat under a stolen banner." A low murmur of assent rippled around the room. Melisandre's gaze lingered on Robb, but she remained silent. Her presence alone seemed to radiate an otherworldly hush. Robb tried to ignore the chill that crawled beneath his skin when her eyes fell upon him, like 2 embers banking in a bed of coals. When the council adjourned, the men went their separate ways, and Robb found himself stepping outside into a chill wind that carried the tang of distant water. The fortress courtyard lay cloaked in the gloom of early night. Torches guttered on the ramparts, illuminating the towering shapes of the twins. Each silhouette looked like a colossal tombstone. It struck him that the last time he had walked these grounds, he had been a guest, a doomed lamb led to slaughter. Now the roles were reversed. Walder Frey was the one locked behind iron bars, destined for a reckoning. "How strange that I have come full circle," he thought, standing in the same courtyard where once his men died in droves. He glanced at the sky, where clouds drifted across a waxing moon. A memory tugged at him of gray wind, prowling the grounds outside these walls, spooked by the hostility in the air. That night, he had told himself that old Walder was untrustworthy but not suicidal. He had been so sure that whatever disagreements lay between them, the phrase would never violate the sacred laws of hospitality. He had been terribly wrong. A knot of anger and sorrow twisted in his gut. Grey Wind was gone forever, along with his mother, along with so many loyal men. He clenched his fists, then forced them to relax. He was no longer that naive boy. Death had changed him. There would be no illusions this time. The next morning found the fortress abuzz with activity. Robb directed the disposal of bodies, set temporary garrisons to hold the towers, and oversaw the writing of letters to spread news of the Frey's downfall across the Riverlands. While strolling through a muddy courtyard, he spotted Melisandre kneeling by a pyre. Several men under her direction gently placed fry corpses onto a stack of timbers. Robb hesitated. He had no sympathy for men who had slaughtered his kin, but it was an odd sight, seeing the Red Woman preside over their final disposal. She stood as she sensed him watching. "We burn them so they do not return as something worse," she said, voice soft yet carrying easily through the crisp air. "The winter grows near, and in the far north, darker forces stir. The Lord of Light protects us from the mockery of life that is undeath." He gave a short nod. He had heard enough unsettling tales of whites and white walkers to accept that burnt bodies could never rise again. "Do as you must," he said. "Though I wonder, why show them even that courtesy?" Her gaze was distant. "It is not courtesy but necessity. Darkness seeks any foothold. These men gave themselves to treachery in life. We will not let them be puppets in death." Before he could reply, she raised her hands and murmured a prayer, and the pile of timbers burst into flame. The heat radiated outward, sudden and fierce, despite the wet wood. Robb took a step back, feeling the singe on his cheeks. The men around the pyre muttered about witchcraft, but none dared speak it too loudly. He turned away, remembering the darkness he had floated in, that sense of infinite cold before she had dragged him back to life. In that void, there had been no promise of light or peace, only an endless nothingness that chilled his soul. Whatever power Melisandre wielded, he was bound to it now, bound by the simple fact that he breathed. Soon after, he met with Edmure Tully in a small courtyard nook. They sat on a wooden bench near a scraggly vine that clung to the stone. Edmure's injuries remained raw, but he had the strength to walk and speak. A warmth passed between them, the shared knowledge that they were kin, all that remained of a broken alliance once sealed in trust. "Riverrun has been subjugated for some time," Edmure explained, voice low. The phrase, bolstered by Lannister gold, forced the castle's garrison to stand down or starve. "My uncle, Brynden the Blackfish, escaped. He vanished into the wilderness. If he still lives, he might be rallying loyal Tully knights somewhere beyond the castle's walls." Robb's mood brightened momentarily at the mention of Brynden Tully. "I fought beside him early in the war. If he's free, we'll find him. We'll need every experienced man if we're to wrest the Riverlands from the Lannisters' grip." Edmure nodded with fervor. "Please, let's see Riverrun liberated. I want to stand on its walls again, see our banners flying freely. Too much has been lost already." Robb assured him that they would ride for Riverrun as soon as they fortified the twins and reprovisioned. Taking the castle would serve as more than mere reclamation. It would give them a strategic base in the Riverlands, bridging any push northward. Edmure's shoulders sagged in relief. They parted, and Robb spent the rest of the day in the improvised war room, conferring with various lords and knights to finalize the next march. He distributed men for garrison duty, ensuring the Freys could not retake their seat. He gave explicit orders to treat the local small folk decently. They had suffered enough. Many had lost relatives to Walder Frey's cruelty. Now, those same people hovered in the fortress's shadow, uncertain if they had traded one set of oppressors for another. Robb made a point to speak with them personally where possible, to reassure them that House Stark meant to restore order, not so further misery. Some looked at him with wide eyes, as though seeing a ghost, but their fear gradually gave way to hesitant gratitude. By the time evening came, the fortress felt newly subdued. The fires from Melisandre's pyres still crackled, and a dull glow suffused the horizon. Robb found a small chamber in the southern tower, not the largest nor the most comfortable, but at least it was clean. He sank onto a cot, removing his armor piece by piece. Fatigue weighed on him now that the battle's fury had cooled. The ache of old wounds flared, reminding him that his sinews had once been pierced by arrows, and that his body was a tapestry of hurts loosely knit together by the Red Woman's incantations. He drifted into a weary sleep, only to be haunted by fractured dreams. He saw a half-ruined Winterfell wreathed in snowdrifts, the walls blackened by fire. Shapes moved in the courtyard, shambling silhouettes with blue eyes that glowed like pale stars. A great swirl of darkness overshadowed them, deeper than any mortal night. Then, from the gloom, a single flame erupted. He saw himself there, holding a torch, as if to ward off an endless horde. In that flicker of light, he sensed uncounted souls behind him, Northmen, Riverlanders, perhaps all of Westeros, crammed into a narrow corridor of survival. He woke with a start, gasping for air, his brow soaked in sweat. For a moment, the chill from the dream still clung to his skin. He rose, splashed water on his face, and forced his racing heart to slow. These visions, which had followed him since his resurrection, seemed to grow more vivid with every step he took toward reclaiming the North. They reminded him of Melisandre's warnings, of the dire threat beyond the wall. He understood now that dethroning the Boltons and punishing traitors was merely the start of something far grander and more terrible. But first, he had to free Riverrun. Within days, Robb and his assembled host marched west, leaving behind a reinforced garrison at the Twins. Walder Frey had been securely locked in a windowless cell, his wails echoing through the halls, but the men sworn to House Stark had their orders to keep him alive. The old man would face a reckoning under the eyes of the realm. Word had also been sent to lords across the Riverlands, informing them that the king in the north was no ghost. He was real, alive, and bringing justice for every slight inflicted by the treacherous Freys. Many doubting hearts would be forced to confront the truth when the wave of liberation swept across their lands. They traveled with caution, well aware that Lannister or Frey outriders might lurk on the roads. But the once proud Frey networks were in disarray, confused by rumors that their ancient seat had fallen in a single day and their patriarch taken captive. Any man bold enough to test Robb Stark's outriders quickly realized that the king in the north now fought with a mixture of cunning and relentless drive that none could match. They pressed on across farmland that showed signs of old battles. Burnt homesteads, trampled fields, broken fences. Crows circled in the distance, and the small folk peered out from behind shuttered windows at the column of soldiers winding down the road. As they neared Riverrun, the land became greener, the rolling terrain dotted with stands of elm and beech. The waters of the Red Fork glittered under the wan sunlight. Yet the mood grew tense, for they knew that Lannister or Frey forces might still be entrenched around the castle. Edmure rode beside Robb, still wan from his captivity but buoyed by hope. He often pointed out landmarks from his youth, an old mill, a crumbling watchtower, his voice brightening at memories of simpler days. But each sign of war's ravages sobered him again. Finally, from the crest of a hill they beheld Riverrun. The castle stood majestic at the confluence of the Red Fork and the Tumblestone. Its walls rose from the waters, forming a triangular fortress that had once been near impregnable under the Tully banners. But now Robb saw signs of neglect and partial ruin. Sections of the outer walls bore scorch marks. The portcullis looked battered. Defunct catapults sat half-submerged in the moat, as if left to rot. And above the main gate, a Lannister lion drooped in the wind, alongside the twin towers of House Frey, tattered and stained by the elements. No Tully trout flew at all. A hush fell across Robb's host. Edmure swallowed hard, tears shining briefly in his eyes. "Look at what they've done," he whispered. "My father's seat." Robb set his jaw. "We'll restore it." Then, raising a hand, he signaled the forward scouts to circle the perimeter, searching for hidden enemy camps. He dismounted, conferring with his captains. They guessed that only a small garrison remained inside, for most of the Frey strength had been drawn away when Walder consolidated his forces at the Twins. The Lannisters, too, had largely withdrawn their armies after the War of the Five Kings splintered into new conflicts, focusing on the crownlands and alliances in the south. That left Riverrun undermanned. Robb smelled opportunity. They wasted little time. Under cover of night, his outriders skirmished with a handful of sentries posted along the roads. One unlucky group of Frey men tried to flee but were swiftly captured. They confirmed that a token force of perhaps a few hundred remained in Riverrun, commanded by a Frey cousin, Edmure, or perhaps Ryman. The prisoners couldn't agree. A handful of Lannister guards oversaw them, presumably waiting to see whether more reinforcements would arrive from the west. Robb wasted no breath on demands for surrender. At dawn, he set his men to quietly block the roads and river approaches, then approached the castle from multiple angles. A small group of swimmers, men from the Neck who excelled at such tactics, slipped into the tumblestone and made their way around Riverrun's water gate, setting up a diversion. At a precise signal, they unleashed a torrent of logs and debris that hammered the gate from the outside. As the defenders scrambled to respond, Robb's main assault began at the landward gate. Grapples and ladders rose against the walls. Northmen at the vanguard surged across shallow parts of the moat. Arrows hissed from the defenders, but were met by a barrage of return fire from Robb's archers. Edmure Tully insisted on fighting. Among the first wave, weakened though he was, and Robb did not deny him that right. Edmure was the lord of Riverrun, and it was his home they were retaking. Still, Robb kept men close to protect him. They might have had the advantage, but an arrow was no respecter of lineage. The fighting was fierce but short-lived. The defenders, outnumbered and demoralized by the staggering fall of the Twins, broke after a desperate hour. By late morning, the drawbridge shuddered downward, allowing Robb's forces to flood the courtyard. He galloped in on a borrowed horse, sword at the ready. The last pockets of Frey and Lannister loyalists threw down their arms, kneeling in the muddy courtyard. Edmure dismounted, tears openly streaming as he beheld the battered walls and battered people. Tully colors hung tattered, half ripped from the ramparts. He marched directly to the nearest group of prisoners. "I am Edmure Tully," he declared, voice trembling with both sorrow and anger. "This castle is mine by blood and by right. You have two choices: surrender and be tried for your part in this occupation, or resist and be cut down." The men stammered pleas, some insisting they had only followed orders. Robb disdained their excuses. He walked among them, letting the hush of fear weigh upon them, reminding himself that these men had kept Edmure Tully in chains, had starved the last loyal servants of Riverrun. Yet he also recalled the vow he'd made to carry out justice openly. Rage still simmered in his heart, but he refused to become a wanton butcher. A public trial would come in time. Thus, Riverrun was retaken. Edmure Tully tore down the Lannister and Frey banners with his own hands, casting them into the Red Fork. The Tully trout soared once more from the highest tower, a battered but poignant emblem of renewal. The small folk of the surrounding area emerged in droves to greet their rightful lord's return. They offered timid thanks and prayers of gratitude, many staring at Robb Stark as though he were an apparition. The rumor had preceded him. A king returned from death to rescue them from oppression. Some knelt, some merely whispered to each other, but in every face, Robb saw a flicker of hope. Perhaps, for the first time since the War of the Five Kings began, these lands felt the stirring of genuine possibility. Within days, the castle's halls rang with the bustle of restoration. The battered garrison was replaced with loyal Tully men, joined by Northmen sworn to House Stark. Repair crews began the arduous task of patching walls, mending gates, and clearing the moat of debris. Maesters tended the wounded. Cellars were inventoried, revealing scarcities of grain and salted meat. The Lannisters and Freys had bled the countryside of resources, leaving the people hungry. Robb ordered that relief caravans from the Twins be organized, though it would take time before the highways were secure. Amid this flurry of activity, Melisandre remained an enigmatic figure. She prowled the ramparts at sunset, gazing over the rivers, lost in thought. The local folk whispered that she must be a witch, her flame-bright hair marking her as an emissary of strange gods. Yet no one dared confront her openly. After all, she had helped restore their rightful lord, and she stood at Robb Stark's side. Daeron sometimes muttered to Robb that the men were uneasy about her presence, but so far no conflict had arisen. Robb suspected she sensed the tension. She simply did not care. At last, once Riverrun's defenses were stabilized, Robb called a great gathering in its great hall. Edmure Tully sat in his father's seat, though he deferred to Robb in matters of formal address, acknowledging him as king in the north. Lords and knights from the surrounding region began to arrive, eager to see if the rumors were true. So, on a late autumn day, they assembled, grim-faced Malisters, proud Blackwoods, pragmatic Brackens, and smaller lords who had once followed the Tully banner but had since been cowed or coerced by Frey Dominion. They all came to glimpse the phenomenon that was Robb Stark reborn and to weigh their next steps in the fractious politics of the Riverlands. Robb stood at the front of the hall with Edmure. The banners of House Tully and House Stark hung side by side, repaired as best as possible. The men and women who entered wore expressions of shock when they saw Robb in the flesh, bearing scars but undeniably alive. Murmurs spread in a hushed wave each time a new party arrived. Some lords knelt outright, others simply bowed, but all regarded him with caution. When silence fell, Robb addressed them. He spoke of the grievous betrayal by the Freys, who had violated the sanctity of guest right by murdering his family at the Red Wedding. He recounted how they had held Edmure Tully captive, how they had suppressed these lands through intimidation and cruelty. Then he proclaimed that justice must be done, not simply through bloodshed, but through a lawful reckoning that would forever stain the Frey's name and warn others against such treachery. Lords who had hedged their bets under Frey Dominion shifted uncomfortably. They stole glances at one another, perhaps wondering if they would be implicated in the trials. But Robb's voice, steady and resonant, carried an undercurrent of both resolution and surprising mercy. He declared that those who had been coerced into Frey service would be allowed to atone, if they now pledged themselves to restoring the peace of the Riverlands under Tully leadership. Those who had actively conspired in the Red Wedding or committed further atrocities would face the king's judgment. No distinctions, no favoritism. The crowd listened, rapt. Then Edmure took the floor. Though still gaunt, he mustered an impassioned speech calling for unity among the River Lords. Riverrun's gates, he said, would always be open to those who fought against the Lannisters' tyranny and the Frey's treachery. Applause rippled through the hall, subdued at first but gaining strength as more lords stepped forward, offering their swords and fealty. It was a careful dance. Some were truly relieved to see a chance to break free of Lannister shackles. Others were simply frightened of the unstoppable new legend that was Robb Stark. But in the end, many bent the knee or gave heartfelt oaths. The tide was shifting. Still, Robb knew words were but one step. Actions would matter more. And so, with Riverrun reclaimed and the River Lords cautiously aligning under the Tully banner again, he turned his gaze northward. Winterfell awaited. The Boltons were an even greater betrayal, for they had once been sworn to House Stark, only to plunge a dagger in its back at the Red Wedding. Roose Bolton, cunning and cold, had claimed the wardenship of the North by Tywin Lannister's decree. Now that Tywin was rumored to be dead, murdered on his privy at King's Landing, Roose's position might be weaker, but he remained perilous. And Ramsay Snow, his bastard, was known to rule through sadism and fear, terrorizing the people of the Dreadfort. On a gray morning, Robb received a secret letter. The courier who brought it claimed to be from the Brotherhood without banners. The parchment was crude, the seal non-existent, but the words inside echoed with sincerity. The letter warned Robb of increasing chaos in the northern Riverlands, where the remnants of the Mountain's men still pillaged, where Frey loyalists turned brigand. It also spoke of shadowy rumors from the Neck. Men from the Dreadfort had been spotted, perhaps scouting or kidnapping small folk for unknown designs. Robb read it twice, then turned to Melisandre, who sat nearby in a window seat, gazing at the stormy sky. The letter suggests Bolton's men are testing the boundaries of the Riverlands, he said. They might be trying to spy on our progress. She inclined her head slightly, red hair falling across her shoulder. "It is no surprise. The Boltons must know of your resurrection by now. They will be preparing." A muscle in Robb's jaw twitched. "Then we must not tarry here. The Riverlands are all but secure, with the Freys shattered and the Lannisters overextended. Edmure and the Riverlords can hold their own against any minor raids. My place is in the north. I must take Winterfell back and unseat Roose Bolton." Melisandre's dark eyes flickered. "A great challenge waits in the north. I see it in the flames. But you are not alone, your grace. My power is pledged to guide you. And these men who have knelt to you, they are prepared to follow you into the cold." He studied her, uneasy yet resigned. As much as he mistrusted sorcery, he recognized her unwavering commitment. "We march then," he said. "I'll leave enough men to help Edmure defend Riverrun. The rest, Northmen and Riverlanders who will venture with me, shall set out within the fortnight." A flurry of preparations followed. Edmure organized a skeleton garrison and set about resupplying Robb's forces for the long road to Winterfell. Letters were sent to White Harbor, coordinating with Lord Wyman Manderley to converge near Moat Cailin. Scouts were dispatched to gauge the conditions of the Neck, a treacherous marshland that had unmade many an invading army. During this time, Walder Frey remained imprisoned at the Twins, awaiting the formal trial Robb had promised. Some pressed Robb to stage the trial immediately at Riverrun, but he refused. With the majority of Frey lands in chaos, any hasty proceedings might appear vindictive rather than just. Besides, Robb needed to focus on retaking his ancestral home. Once he had Winterfell, he could hold a trial in the seat of Stark power, or even in Riverrun later, with the entire realm invited to witness. For now, Walder would languish in chains, an old man racked by fear for his many heirs scattered across Westeros, some of whom had died in the retaking of the Twins. At last, when all was ready, Robb gathered his forces in Riverrun's main courtyard. It was a cold morning, the sky leaden with the threat of snow, though winter had not yet truly settled on the Riverlands. Banners of the wolf and the trout fluttered in the wind. Columns of spearmen, archers, and mounted knights prepared to march. Horses snorted, steam rising from their nostrils. Edmure approached Robb, clasping his hand. "I'll hold this castle in your name," he said. "I swear, Riverrun will always be ready to receive you and your men, should you need a southern refuge or supply lines." Robb pulled him into a brief embrace, mindful of his uncle's injuries. "Thank you, uncle. Your loyalty honors my mother's memory. May the gods watch over you." Edmure nodded, eyes shining. "Go retake your home, Robb. Then, let all of Westeros see House Stark restored." Robb mounted his horse, the surcoat over his mail emblazoned with the Stark direwolf. Darren and a handful of seasoned Northmen rode at his side. Behind them came Riverlander knights, among them a few bearing the sigil of House Blackwood, who had declared early support for the renewed Tully Stark alliance. Others from houses Mallister and Vance rode under their lords' banners. It was not the largest army Robb had ever commanded, but it was cohesive and fiercely devoted. They respected him not just as a king, but as a symbol of retribution against the monstrous betrayals that had marred the realm. Melisandre departed with them, riding a black mare near the front of the column. Though she was not a warrior, no one questioned her place. A hush seemed to follow her wherever she went, as if the horses themselves recognized some intangible power. Thus began the march north. It was not a quick journey. Autumn's lingering presence gave way to the first real bite of winter as they passed the ruins of villages and farmland that had seen too many battles. The small folk sometimes emerged to watch the column pass, relief mixing with curiosity in their eyes. They offered small tokens of food where they could. Robb thanked them, urging them to keep their families safe, promising that the realm would know stability again, once House Stark set things right in the north. The roads turned muddier as they neared the Neck, the narrow tract of swampy land that separated the north from the Riverlands. Legend claimed that in ancient times, the children of the forest had shattered the land bridge here, flooding it to halt the first men's advance. Now it remained a labyrinth of marsh, bogs, and slow-moving creeks, where House Reed held sway. Robb sent a missive ahead, hoping to rouse the Reeds from Greywater Watch, though that fortress was notorious for its uncanny ability to vanish and reappear in the depths of the swamp. Even so, if the Reeds learned of his approach, they might send guides or scouts to ensure his army passed safely. As the host picked its way along the narrow causeways, the men's spirits wavered. Clouds of mosquitoes and flies became relentless. The damp cold sank into bones, and the ground threatened to swallow unwary horses. But Robb's leadership and the promise of reclaiming Winterfell kept them moving. The Outriders reported occasional sightings of Bolton scouts, though no direct confrontations took place. It seemed the Dreadfort's men preferred to lurk, perhaps uncertain how to handle the large force that now encroached upon the north. One night, they made camp in a dry clearing, ringed by low-hanging cypress trees. The flicker of campfires reflected on murky pools. Robb hunkered down by one of the larger fires, discussing the next day's march with Darren and a few Riverlander knights. Just as they were concluding, a soft step disturbed the reeds nearby. A young man with green and brown mottled clothing emerged, a bog spear slung across his back. The men sprang to their feet, hands on their blades, but Robb raised a hand for calm. He recognized the figure as a Crannogman, possibly from House Reed's domain. "Peace," the young man said in a quiet voice. "I bring greetings from Lord Howland Reed. He bids the king in the north welcome to the neck." Relief flitted across Robb's features. He had not seen Howland Reed in years, but his father, Ned Stark, had always spoken highly of the man's loyalty and cunning. "Then you are most welcome," Robb replied. "Will Lord Reed see us?" The Crannogman bobbed his head. "He has arranged a safe route for your host. We will guide you around the deeper bogs so you do not lose men or horses to the mire. We stand ready to join the king in the north for the retaking of Winterfell." A quiet murmur of approval ran through Robb's nearby companions. House Reed might not field large armies, but their knowledge of the marshes was invaluable, and they were fiercely loyal to House Stark. Robb stood, extending his hand. "You have my thanks. Show us the way and we'll do the rest." And so they pressed onward, guided by the Crannogmen. Each day the air grew colder, a promise that winter truly was descending. Brief flurries of snow dusted the swamp grasses, an unusual sight in these southern reaches of the neck. The men huddled in cloaks at night, and the scent of their cookfires mingled with the tang of stagnant marsh water. Melisandre seemed unmoved by the chill. She rode or walked in silence, eyes fixed on a horizon only she could see. At length they reached firmer ground north of the neck, where the land began to rise. High grasses gave way to stony hills. The vast emptiness of the north sprawled before them, dotted by lonely stands of pine and spruce. Some men let out whoops of joy. Others breathed in the crisp northern wind as though it were the first true taste of home. Robb himself felt a lump in his throat. He had never thought to see these lands again. The last time he rode south, he had done so as a king leading a grand host to rescue his father. Then had come heartbreak, betrayal, and death. Now, resurrected and tempered by suffering, he returned with a smaller army but a mightier will. In the days that followed, they advanced toward Moat Cailin, a series of ancient towers perched along a causeway that commanded the main approach from the south. The towers had been built in the days of the first men and were partially ruined, but they remained a formidable choke point. Word reached Robb that a garrison of Bolton men, perhaps with a few Fry remnants, held Moat Cailin, hoping to deny him entrance to the north. If the rumors were true, the defenders already quaked at the prospect of facing the king in the north come back from the grave. Robb let none of that deter him. He posted scouts and prepared for a swift assault. Given the swamps and the dilapidated state of the towers, the defenders would rely on archers and narrow causeways. But Robb was done waiting. He ordered siege lines set up, archers to form ranks behind makeshift palisades, and sent the Crannogmen to harass the garrison from the flanks, popping out of bogs at night to stab unwary sentries or sabotage the tower's foundations. Over a handful of days, the Bolton men inside Moat Cailin discovered that their fortress was more a cage than a defense. Their supplies ran low, disease crept through the ranks, and every attempt to sally out ended in a hail of arrows from Robb's disciplined archers. Finally, the battered garrison tried to negotiate. A handful of Bolton men rode out under a ragged white flag, their eyes shifting nervously as they asked for terms. Robb stood at the forefront of his lines, a winter sun gleaming off his armor, his expression implacable. He stated that any men who surrendered would receive fair treatment, save for the known murderers among them. The garrison had one day to comply. Predictably, disputes erupted among the defenders. Some were ready to yield rather than face certain death. Others feared Roose Bolton's reprisals more than they feared Robb Stark's. After an anxious night, the gates opened. The men inside Moat Cailin laid down their arms. Robb's soldiers surged in, finding the place a miserable ruin. Half-flooded corridors, collapsed walls, a reek of sickness. Many of the Bolton men threw themselves on Robb's mercy, claiming they had been conscripted. Robb commanded that all survivors be held in makeshift pens until their stories could be verified. The handful who wore flayed man sigils proudly or bore known atrocities on their heads were swiftly separated for trial, or worse. He would not risk letting the truly vile slip away. Once Moat Cailin was his, he wasted no time fortifying it, ensuring that if any Lannister or Frey force tried to march north, they would find a formidable new obstacle. The fall of Moat Cailin sent shockwaves through the north. Ravens flew in every direction, carrying tidings that Robb Stark had returned, unstoppable, claiming stronghold after stronghold. The small folk of the north, long oppressed by Bolton rule, reacted with stifled hope. Clans in the hills of the west began to stir. Lords who had bent the knee to Roose Bolton out of fear now hesitated, uncertain if they should remain loyal to the flayed man or risk a renewed bond with House Stark. Roose, from his seat at the Dreadfort, would not sit idle. Scouts reported that Bolton men were withdrawing from outlying posts and concentrating near Winterfell. Ramsay Snow, the bastard, had apparently seized that holdfast after it was left in ruins by Theon Greyjoy's men. Reports were conflicting on the state of the castle. Some said it was half-burned, others that repairs were underway. But all insisted that Bolton banners now flew where the direwolf once soared. Robb wasted no time. With Moat Cailin secured, he pressed deeper into the north, forging alliances as he went. Smaller houses, Barrowton men, the Dustons, the Mormonts, began sending feelers, some openly joining his march, others secretly letting him know they were on his side. The Karstarks remained uncertain. They had once revolted against Robb for executing Lord Rickard Karstark over the murder of young Lannister hostages. Robb had no illusions that the Karstarks would greet him with open arms, but many of their people, especially the peasants, had no love for Bolton rule. The glacial churn of northern politics offered no easy path. Yet each day, more swords were added to Robb's cause. As they traveled north, the temperatures plummeted. Patches of snow turned into a continuous blanket, and the nights grew dangerously cold. Men wrapped themselves in fur cloaks, bundling close to their fires. Horses struggled to find forage. Yet each hardship only seemed to steal the loyalty of those following Robb. He led from the front, enduring the same elements, the same hunger, the same chill. There were no illusions of comfort. Around the time they reached the outskirts of the Dreadfort sphere of influence, isolated hamlets where the flayed man's banner had long instilled terror, Robb discovered signs of the Bolton brand of rule. Farms lay abandoned, the doors broken in, no animals to be seen. A hush hung over the countryside, as though the land itself feared to speak. When they found living villagers, they were huddled in hovels, scarred by old punishments that Bolton men had visited upon them for trifling infractions. A fury simmered beneath Robb's skin, remembering how his father had once instilled in him the duty of a lord to protect those who could not protect themselves. The Boltons had twisted that duty into a sadistic tyranny. One evening, in a half-ruined barn that served as a temporary shelter against a blizzard, Robb conferred with Darren and a few lords about their next steps. Melisandre hovered near the entrance, the wind rattling the boards. A single lantern cast flickering shadows on the straw-strewn floor. "The Dreadfort is a fortress built for cruelty," Darren said, tightening his cloak around him. We could try to besiege it, but it would take time. Ramsay might choose to burn it rather than let us capture it if they feel cornered." Robb shook his head. "The Dreadfort is Roose Bolton's seat, but our real objective is Winterfell. We'll leave a force to contain the Dreadfort from the east, while the bulk of our men swing west. Let Ramsay hole up in that cursed place if he wants. He'll find himself starved of supplies before long." A lean Mormont man, bearded and fierce, frowned. "You intend to march on Winterfell itself, then?" "Yes," Robb said. "It's symbolic and strategic. Once Winterfell is reclaimed, the other northern houses will have no choice but to rally. Bolton Dominion will crumble, and the dread father and son pair will be forced to face us there or flee. Word is that Ramsay's turned Winterfell into a labyrinth of traps," another knight warned. "He's a cunning bastard, and I mean that in every sense of the word." Robb's gaze hardened. "I'm done letting fear rule. We'll see how cunning he is when confronted by an army of Northmen who remember the rightful warden of the North. Winterfell is mine by blood. I will not see it remain in traitors' hands." A soft whisper of wind made the rafters groan. Melisandre's eyes glowed in the dim lantern light. "Dark tidings swirl around that place," she said in a near chant. "I see a swirl of snow and blood, a great pack of wolves howling at the gates, and behind them, a deeper cold. Beware complacency, your grace." He inclined his head. "I know what I march into. The Boltons would see me dead a second time if they could." His mouth set in a grim line. "But I have come back once. If I must do it again, so be it." In the bleak dawn, as they set out again, a sense of inevitability pervaded the army. They trudged through rising drifts of snow, forging on despite the bitter wind. The dread of the Boltons mingled with the hope that the Stark line would be restored. Whispers circulated among the common soldiers that if Robb Stark could reclaim Winterfell after rising from the grave, perhaps the old ways of the North, honor, loyalty, kinship, could be revived. That possibility nourished them more than any meager rations. A few days later, their outriders returned with urgent news. A small host flew the banner of the flayed man and was advancing from the west, possibly attempting to intercept Robb's force before it could reach Winterfell. The outriders estimated this group at perhaps 1,000 men, heavily armed, accompanied by hounds, likely led by Ramsay himself or one of his captains. That meant a confrontation was imminent. Robb halted the march and prepared for battle. He deployed archers in a staggered line, concealed by the rolling terrain. His cavalry formed a wedge behind a low ridge, ready to charge when signaled. Infantry took positions in a shallow valley, shields at the ready, half hidden by the light snow that drifted in thick flakes. They waited, tense, as the gloom of a northern afternoon deepened. The wind carried the faint baying of hounds. Men muttered about Ramsay's savage hunts, the terror inflicted upon any who displeased him. Then the enemy came into view, a dark smear on the horizon, growing more distinct as they drew near. Through the swirling snow, Robb made out their vanguard, a snarling pack of dogs led by riders wearing flayed man surcoats. He saw the pale face of Ramsay Snow. Though still distant, the man's stance was unmistakably cruel, the set of his shoulders brimming with a predator's arrogance. Robb's blood pounded in his ears. This was the fiend who had tormented so many innocents, who had locked Theon Greyjoy in a nightmare, who had dared claim Winterfell for his father. When the Bolton host drew close enough, Robb gave the signal. A horn blast echoed. His archers rose from their concealed positions, loosing a wave of arrows that streaked across the snow-laden air. The Bolton men reeled. Ramsay's hounds yelped as half of them fell in the first volley. Men shouted, trying to form ranks under the sudden barrage. Robb's cavalry thundered forward, cresting the ridge with a roar of hooves. At their head, Robb brandished his sword, eyes fixed on Ramsay's line. He saw the bastard's face contort in fury, saw him spur his horse to rally his troops. But it was too late. The cavalry crashed into them like a steel avalanche, scattering men and dogs alike. Amid the chaos, Robb steered his horse toward the center of the melee, where he glimpsed Ramsay. Sword met sword, and for a tense moment they were face to face. Ramsay had a thin, mocking grin on his lips, as though the carnage thrilled him. Robb felt a surge of icy wrath flood his veins. This was no mere foe. This was the man who embodied the vile cruelty that had betrayed House Stark. Their blades rang out in a flurry of parries and thrusts. Ramsay was quick, darting in with cunning feints. But Robb's reflexes, tuned by death and resurrection, sharpened by months of relentless practice, proved superior. He parried a savage diagonal slash, then pivoted, slamming his sword pommel into Ramsay's flank. The bastard wobbled in the saddle, spitting curses. Before Robb could finish him, a press of Bolton infantry surged between them, desperate to protect their commander. Robb cut down 2 of them with swift strokes, but the swirl of battle carried him aside, away from his target. The cavalry surge continued, driving the Bolton line backward. Ramsay tried to regroup, barking orders and flailing at his own men to form up. Another arrow volley from Robb's archers harried them. The air filled with screams and the reek of blood. Snow churned into crimson slush underfoot. Seeing the tide turn against them, Ramsay's men began to break. Some tried to flee across the snowy fields, only to be cut down by pursuing cavalry. Ramsay himself vanished into the confusion. Robb scoured the battlefield, searching for that pale face. Instead, he found only scattered riders galloping away. A few men recognized the king in the north and threw down their weapons, pleading for mercy. When the last pockets of resistance collapsed, the field fell silent except for the moans of the dying and the distant whimper of wounded hounds. Snow continued to drift, covering the carnage in a cold shroud. Robb dismounted, adrenaline thrumming. "Find Ramsay," he ordered. "Dead or alive, bring me proof." Men fanned out, searching among corpses, but found no sign of the bastard. The best guess was that he'd slipped away early, leaving his men to their fate. A typical move for a coward with illusions of greatness. Robb felt anger twist in his gut. Ramsay's escape meant the monstrous heir to House Bolton would be waiting at Winterfell, or, worse yet, might lay some trap for them. But no matter. Robb would not halt until Winterfell was his. Let Ramsay run and hide in the cracks. They set up a makeshift camp near the battlefield, lighting fires to ward off the deepening chill. Captured Bolton men huddled under guard, their faces ashen. Robb walked among the wounded, directing maesters to treat friend and foe alike. His men had learned that this king did not leave prisoners to rot in the snow, though he was not above bringing traitors to a fair trial. Compassion was not weakness, his father had taught him. It was the mark of the strong. Yet in his heart, Robb felt little but the raw edge of hate for the Boltons. When the night fell, he stood on a small rise overlooking the battlefield. Ghostly shapes of men moved in the torchlight, gathering the fallen for pyres or shallow graves. The wind carried the scent of death. He let his gaze roam across the swirling flakes, imagining the final confrontation to come. Winterfell was but a handful of days away now, perhaps more, given the snows. Soon he would see its familiar walls. Soon he would stand in the courtyard where he had once run with his siblings, where Ned Stark had imparted the lessons of leadership and mercy. The memory felt like another life entirely. He heard soft footsteps behind him and turned to see Melisandre, her robes swirling around her in the wind. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air cold enough to bite. The red glow in her eyes flickered. "You walk a path steeped in blood, Robb Stark," she said, voice low. "You will see yet more before this is over." He turned his gaze back to the silent battlefield. "I know. There's no turning back now." She inclined her head, a motion as graceful as the drift of embers. "Lawloress flame has marked you for a purpose. Do not doubt that your trials are far from done." He almost laughed, but it came out more a grim sigh. "My only purpose is to save my home. Whatever prophecy you cling to, that's your business. But if your God wants to help me dethrone these monsters, I won't refuse." For a moment, she studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she turned, red robes trailing across the snow as she retreated into the darkness. Robb exhaled, letting the cold air fill his lungs. He wondered if some part of him was changing too much, if the line between justice and vengeance had blurred beyond recognition. But the memory of Grey Wind's severed head, his mother's last scream, the betrayal at the twins, it all hardened his resolve. He could still preserve the North from cruelty. Yet he would not shy from the ugly realities that would achieve it. In the dawn, they buried or burned the dead, said the rites for those who had fallen bravely. Then the army pressed on, step by step, through the thickening snow. Each day they drew closer to Winterfell, and each day the sky seemed to grow darker, as though the looming heart of winter recognized the significance of what was about to unfold. On the final day of their approach, the clouds broke just enough for Robb and his outriders to glimpse the outline of Winterfell on the horizon. The old granite walls jutted from the snowy plain like the bones of a giant. Smoke curled from within the courtyard, suggesting repairs and habitation. Bolton banners hung forlornly at intervals, blotting out the stark sigil that once flew there with quiet pride. Robb felt his pulse thunder. He recalled galloping through that very gate as a child, returning from hunts with Theon and Jon, brandishing wooden swords in boisterous play. So much had changed. The Theon who had once been his friend was now missing, or worse, lost to the chaos of the Ironborn betrayal and Ramsay's torture. Jon was far away at the wall, perhaps embroiled in his own struggles. All of them scattered, broken. But he, Robb, had defied death. He would reclaim his birthright. He summoned his commanders and quietly laid out a plan. Winterfell possessed formidable walls, but it had been sacked more than once in recent memory. Ramsay's men might have restored sections, but the battered fortress could not withstand a protracted siege. Still, they had to be wary of traps and hidden dangers. The men listened with grim attention, conscious that they stood on the threshold of a confrontation with one of the cruelest men in Westeros. As twilight settled, they moved into position, forming a ring around Winterfell at a cautious distance. Torches flared in the gloom. A hush cloaked the army as Robb and his captains quietly instructed the siege engineers to prepare. Snow fell again, thick and relentless, blanketing the terrain. Robb could almost feel the ancient heart of the North stirring beneath that blanket, an old power older than any castle. He wondered if the old gods watched this reunion from the weirwood in Winterfell's Godswood. Then, over the howling of the wind, a horn sounded from the fortress ramparts, an eerie, hollow note that signaled the defenders had spotted them. Bolton men shouted curses, brandishing torches. Robb's archers advanced, forging a perimeter. He could see movement on the walls, silhouettes pacing. Something tugged at him. A notion that Ramsay might want a spectacle, might have prepared horrors to greet him. But no matter. One way or another, this would end here. Robb spurred his horse forward, just close enough that his voice could carry to the walls. Snow clung to his hair and eyelashes. He raised his sword, the steel glinting in the torchlight. "I am Robb Stark," he shouted, voice echoing across the field. "Your rightful liege, the king in the north. Open these gates and deliver to me Roose Bolton and Ramsay Snow, who have murdered and tortured the North's own. Surrender and you will be shown mercy. Defy me and face what you have earned." For a long moment, no reply came, only the whistle of the wind. Then a laugh, high and mocking, broke through the night. A figure appeared at the battlements, wrapped in a thick cloak of black fur. Even from this distance, Robb recognized the pale face and the twisted grin of Ramsay Snow. "Little wolf," Ramsay called down. "You should have stayed dead. My father killed you once. I'll finish the task." Robb's knuckles tightened on his reins. "I've had enough of your boasts," he replied, cold fury thrumming in every syllable. "Yield, or I'll tear those walls down stone by stone." Ramsay spread his arms in a theatrical flourish. "Come then, we'll see how the little wolf likes a flaying blade." With a final sneer, he disappeared from sight, leaving only the echo of his vicious laugh. Torches moved along the ramparts. A volley of crossbow bolts zipped overhead, rattling on shields. The defenders had given their answer. Robb wheeled his horse around, returning to his lines. Darren met him, jaw set. "So be it," Robb said softly. "We lay siege. We find their weak points. If we must starve them out, we will. If they force us to assault, we do it carefully. But I mean to end this. Winterfell is ours." No cheer went up, no cry of bravado. The men simply nodded, each face reflecting the solemn gravity of the moment. They had marched long and suffered greatly for this day. Now, the Boltons' final stand loomed before them under a sky heavy with snow. In that hush, Robb felt the presence of the old gods, be it real or imagined, and swore silently that he would restore honor to the North or die trying. So began the siege of Winterfell, in the heart of a gathering winter, with a resurrected king at its gates and a sadistic bastard within. The wind howled over the battlements as though mourning the blood yet to be spilled, but Robb Stark did not falter. He tightened his grip on his sword, ready to confront the darkest chapter of House Bolton's treachery. No matter what horrors awaited within those storied walls, he would walk through them, driven by grief, fueled by vengeance, guided by the flame that refused to let him stay dead. And by that same flame, he would see the North reborn.